Thanks very much. Earlier, someone raised a question about whether female genital cutting would be mentioned in this conference, and indeed that's a large theme of my talk. I'll try to summarize my point in a nutshell, which is that due to some of the anomalies that James laid out in the law, it's the case that female, male, and, as I'll mention, intersex genital cutting are going to rise or sink together. The ethical and legal principles apply to both, even though the facts about what's done in any particular case may differ significantly. And so what I'll argue is, if all you cared about was protecting girls from non-therapeutic genital cutting, you would have to get on board with the arguments to do with boys, because these issues are going to be linked in law and in ethical policy going forward. And I'll just show you why that's the case in the slides to follow. So here's my talk in an outline. A collision course has been set regarding different ethical treatment of female, male, and intersex forms of childhood genital cutting, and the collision in law and policy is actually playing out right now. Prominent defenders of ritual male circumcision are aware that the global zero-tolerance stance toward FGM or FGC, including toward what some people characterize as minor forms of female genital cutting. So this is something that includes what's called a ritual nick. This is a practice where no tissue is actually removed, an incision is made into some part of the vulva, a drop of blood is drawn for ceremonial purposes. But the point here is that if the law says even that is not permitted, and yet it allows a far more invasive procedure on boys, something's going to have to give. Either the law is going to have to tolerate minor forms of FGM, which is what some are now arguing it should do, or it's going to have to take a more restrictive stance toward male circumcision. Now, those who are in favor of ritual male circumcision are aware of this problem. They're aware that there's a double standard. And so to create a buffer of protection around male circumcision, they have now begun summoning arguments that we should indeed tolerate minor forms of female genital cutting. So I have to credit them for intellectual consistency and integrity in this regard. But this is the sort of thing that makes me suggest that these cannot be treated separately. These are going to be one and the same issue to do with children's rights. So as I say, these defenders of ritual male circumcision are now advancing arguments in mainstream journals, including the one that was mentioned, the British Journal of Medical Ethics, which I edited in a subsequent issue. Some prominent ethicists said we should tolerate minor forms of FGM. Defenders of what they would call female circumcision have been emboldened by these moves and are now, in a more active way, taking the arguments directly from the male circumcision playbook, the reasons why people say, well, we should tolerate it, it's religious, it's important, and they're saying, well, that applies to our case, and in any event, the form of cutting we do on our daughters is less invasive than what you tolerate on your boys, so you have to extend the same consideration to us. So the gains of the last 30 years of advocacy and consciousness raising on the part of feminists and global activists to try to protect young girls from cutting in many different settings is now under threat because of these developments. And so I'll suggest that separate discourses are no longer sustainable, where you have boys over here and girls over here and intersex children over here. I'll say more about this third case in just a moment. Moving forward, the argument is going to have to be, if you're a proponent of children's rights, no matter which particular case is the one that matters most to you, there's going to have to be a banding together of those who think that the main issue here has to do with the vulnerability of the person and their lack of ability to consent, rather than where they fall along a spectrum of sex or gender. And I'm going to be highlighting some feminist organizations that have begun to take up these arguments and are now leading the charge in arguing for all children's rights to genital autonomy. Now, the notion that there is a collision course in law is not new to me, and this was raised back in 2001 by Dina Davis, who is a prominent American bioethicist and legal scholar. She said, with respect to the US situation, which applies also in the UK and in many other Western legal jurisdictions, that the federal and state laws that criminalize the genital alteration of female minors are written so broad in their language that, strictly speaking, they cover procedures significantly less substantial than newborn male circumcision. And she says, a complete laissez-faire attitude toward the one practice, coupled with total criminalization of the other, has troubling implications for the constitutional requirement of equal protection, because the laws appear to protect little girls but not little boys from religious and culturally motivated surgery. Now, the United States is facing its first test case of exactly this consideration. This test case is now the first federal FGM law that's being applied to a particular case of a group of Shia Muslims called the Dawoodi Bohra. And in this particular sect, based primarily in India and Pakistan, but with members all over the world, including some in Detroit, Michigan, they perform a practice that they call khatna, which is a word for circumcision. It's the same word they use with respect to what they do to both their sons and their daughters. But in this particular Muslim group, the form of cutting on the daughters is far less invasive than the form of cutting they do within the same families to their sons. Furthermore, this form of cutting is done in a clinical environment. So the way that the debate around FGM has played out in many Western discourses has been focused on these sort of horror stories out of Northeast Africa, where you have these stereotypes of rusty razor blades and far-off villages. Now, in a way, a lot of this has to do with misrepresentation of the diversity of practices around the world, and it's a sort of media likes to focus on the most extreme cases. So in reality, what we call FGM refers to some dozen or more types of practices done in different settings. Some of them are done by doctors, as in this case. So the practice has been, as it's called, medicalized, just as in the United States, my home country, male circumcision has been medicalized and is considered something that is done by doctors in a hospital setting. The same is true of the Dawoodi Bohra. So this woman here, Jumana Nagarwala, is facing basically the rest of her life in prison for, in a clinical setting, performing an instance of cutting on girls, allegedly, that is, by the admission of those in this very same group, less invasive than what's done to their boys, and yet only the female operation is regarded as criminal in US law. So the collision course is happening right now, and this is going to be up before the judge. Now, this is a survey by members from within the Bohra community who are reformers. These are women who are very bravely trying to end the practice of female genital cutting within their group. And so they wouldn't be motivated to minimize the harm done by female genital cutting. And here's what they say. In most instances, the process involves the removal of a pinch of skin from the clitoral hood. That's the tissue that covers the clitoris and is analogous to the foreskin, though it's much smaller in females. They say with respect to the religious significance, well, it's not strictly mentioned in the Quran, the sort of main recognized scripture of Islam. It is indeed mentioned in the Da'im al-Islam, which is a hadith or a sort of collection of sayings attributed to Muhammad. And they say that in this religious text, which is followed by this community, this minor form of female genital cutting is in fact endorsed. And so within this community, the scriptural support for both male and female circumcision, as they would say, is equivalent. Now, you often hear this argument that because, as it's often said in this discourse, FGM is not mentioned in the Quran, therefore it's not religious. Now, this is a ridiculous argument in two different ways. First of all, there's an implied suggestion that if something is a religious practice, therefore it's automatically permissible, or therefore it's worthy of respect. That doesn't follow. There may very well be a religious practice that ought to be criticized. It also seems to imply that, but if it's merely a cultural practice, well, then it's more just like a bad habit that doesn't deserve our respect. That doesn't follow either. Something might be, quote unquote, merely a cultural practice, yet central to the way of life of a group of people, even if it doesn't happen to be codified in some literalistic, Protestant-like way in how we conceive of religion in this society. And so it's wrong on both ends, but nevertheless, the premise in this case is incorrect. It's not true that it's not a religious practice, because what counts as a religious practice in this group is not just what's literally stated in the Quran. So Michael Thompson here, along with a colleague and I, have pointed out, citing the work of others, that just as in Judaism and Christianity, perceived binding religious obligations can arise from oral teachings and extra-biblical sources, Islam also looks to other sources to interpret and supplement the Quran, such as the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So somebody who wants to make this argument would be saying to a Roman Catholic who opposes abortion that it can't be an opposition on religious grounds because there's no literal opposition to abortion where it says some line of, abortion is impermissible in the Bible. That's just clearly not how something attains a religious standing within a community, and yet people are grasping for these ridiculous arguments to try to cordon off female genital cutting and suggest, well, it's just a bad habit, so we don't need to really consider it. We do need to consider it, and in this community it has as much importance and significance as male genital cutting does. And yet we know what the law says about the relationship of religion to female genital cutting. So the religious versus cultural distinction, I think, is a red herring, but I'm now going to argue that actually the distinction between males and females in the law is also facing a collision course. And I'll raise that by introducing the example of persons with what are sometimes called differences of sex development. Some of these individuals identify as intersex, so they take on the identity of somebody who's neither fully male nor female. And so about 1 in every 1,500 or 2,000 births occurs where the child has, in terms of visible external genitalia characteristics, genitals that are neither stereotypically male nor female and fall somewhere between these extremes. Now here's the legal situation. If you move over to the left-hand side of the spectrum, you can cut these genital structures in any Western regime. You don't need to have a medical license to do it, and it's mostly unregulated. You don't have to collect statistics either. As long as you call it a circumcision, you can cut babies with genitals that look like this. If you move over to the other side of the spectrum, it is a criminal offense, sometimes carrying life sentences or decades in prison, heavy fines, extreme stigmatization for those who would cut genitals on this end of the spectrum to any degree. So I'm not just talking about extreme excisions of clitoral tissue with rusty razor blades. I'm saying any incision that's not medically necessary is criminally forbidden on that side of the spectrum. In the middle, you have these intersex conditions, and now people are starting to see why the law is going to have to stop drawing lines based on sex or gender, because in the middle, you have what's sometimes called feminizing clitoroplasty. So if you have an intersex child who has a larger than average clitoris, but no other functional or medical problem, for purely social reasons, it's still common in many Western hospitals for the doctors to excise what they consider excess clitoral tissue. They say, well, she wouldn't want to have a very big clitoris, that might look a little masculine. Well, that's making a big presumption about what she might want later in life, but it's tolerated now to simply excise clitoral tissue. The problem is that just is FGM on the World Health Organization definition. So the law is going to have to sort this out. Now, there aren't just, of course, 6 different stages of genitals. This is more of a spectrum, and so here's the legal question that we're going to have to pay attention to going forward. At what exact point does a small penis, which is legal to cut, become a large clitoris, which is illegal to cut? Now, embryologically, this is the same tissue, and normally it diverges because of exposures to hormones in utero, where the tissue then diverges, and you could characterize a penis as essentially a very large clitoris. That is, in fact, what it is. Or clitoris is a small penis. It's the same tissue with some differences in terms of where the urethra goes through. But in the intersex conditions, it just is the same structure. It just is the same thing. A large penis or a small clitoris, you'd have to come up with a ruler, and you'd have to make an arbitrary definition. A millimeter this way, that's a penis. A millimeter that way, it's a clitoris. And the law is going to draw a distinction based on sex or gender in terms of whose genitals you're allowed to cut? That's not sustainable. So what's happening is that defenders of both male and female genital cutting are recognizing that some of these distinctions are breaking down, and they're both turning now to religious freedom as a way to bolster support for why their cultural practices should be protected. Here's an issue that hasn't received any attention in the literature, so I'm just going to put this on the table in this talk. People are now more and more aware of those who identify as transgender. So this is someone who, roughly speaking, has a gender identity that doesn't align with the sex that's been assigned to them at birth based on their external genital characteristics. When you permanently alter a child's genitals before they've formed an identity, before they've developed even basic preferences, or acquired the capacity to say no, you deprive them of the future autonomy that they might have had over the most private part of their body. So very often in these debates, I hear people talking about ear piercing or letting their children participate in sports, as though these are just clearly comparable activities. But everyone knows that the genitals have significant psychosexual importance to everyone. They're the sort of thing that are especially private. They're the sort of thing that makes us say that sexual assault, compared to other kinds of assault, should be taken more seriously. So everybody agrees that the genitals are the sort of thing that, as James pointed out, if you were 18, there would be an absolute prohibition on anyone so much as touching your genitals without your consent. But here we allow for the permanent modification and removal of erogenous tissue from children born with genitals on one side of the spectrum. With male circumcision in particular, not only do you deprive them of this future choice, you deprive them of quite a lot of tissue in terms of surface area that could be used for surgeries such as gender affirmation surgeries later on. So again, I haven't seen any discussion of this, but I'll put it on the table. When you have a vaginoplasty, which is where you take external male genital structures and you invert them to create a neo-vagina, this can be performed in a single stage and uses the penile shaft skin, foreskin, and scrotal skin. So if you've just removed about 30 or 50 square centimeters of tissue from a baby, that's what it would be in the adult case, that tissue is now not available for these other potential uses. Now, some people say, well, it's a little snip. How much tissue could we really be talking about? It's true that in an infant it's not very much tissue because the penis is very small when you're born, but it grows by about 200% over the course of development, and so at the end of the day you have much larger tissue. Furthermore, there's no dotted line on the penis showing where the foreskin ends and the rest of the penis begins. So when you're dealing with a diminutive structure, you're just making a guess. You're saying, well, we're going to cut here, and we hope that when the penis reaches its full size over a decade later that we won't have accidentally removed too much tissue. Which, by the way, if we have, that's not going to be recorded anywhere as a medical complication because nobody's keeping track of data that long. So I'm going to show you some pictures. These are disturbing, but this is what's done at least 1 million times a year in the United States and more. So the first step in a circumcision is you have to detach the foreskin from the head of the penis, to which it's adhered at birth by a membrane in much the same way that your fingernail is adhered to your finger. And these structures separate naturally over the course of many years, but in order to get the foreskin off at this stage, you have to separate them with a blunt probe. And even with anesthesia, this is excruciating to the infant. In the United States, we use what's called a Gomco clamp primarily. Circumcision can be formed in many different ways, but this is our very civilized way of doing it in the United States. And so here's the final step. You remove what you can see is about half the penile skin system. I mean, it's not, people talk about a flap of skin, and when they say that, I think, oh, they literally don't know what a circumcision is. A circumcision is removing just about half of the penile skin system. This is what you get at the end. Now, this will heal and it won't look so bad in a couple of weeks, but by the way, while this is healing, the child's going to be wearing a diaper, and that wound is going to be exposed to urine and feces and so forth. So you're creating a wound, which I think people don't realize. That's, when we say circumcision, it sounds very sort of gentle and scientific, but that's what you're doing, is creating a wound. Now, if you were to wait till this tissue reached its adult size and you were to unfold it so you could see both layers, you'd have at least as much tissue to cover a credit card. This is actually a slightly smaller than average foreskin on a large sample of about 900 men. And this is also the most sensitive tissue on the penis. This has been shown in a number of studies, but I'll just draw a recent one. The study here shows a lower bar represents a lower tactile threshold, so lower means more sensitive. And as you can see, the foreskin here is more sensitive in terms of light touch sensation and detection of mild sensation of warmth, but it's no more sensitive to pain, which is what's on the right-hand side. So it's basically an acutely sensitive part of the male genitalia. People often think of male sexuality as this grinding and thrusting masculine kind of thing, but in the United States anyway, we actually remove the most sensitive and delicate part of boys' genitals as a regular course. An earlier study showed the same thing. Circumcision removes the most sensitive parts of the penis. Now, if we weren't talking about the foreskin and we were instead talking about the labia, I think people would have different intuitions about what exactly is wrong with removing this tissue from a person. The labia actually constitute a little bit less tissue in the adult on average. Now, if an adult woman wants to have her labia removed or reduced for what she considers cosmetic reasons, you might think that she's been informed by problematic norms that are constrictive about feminine beauty or something like that. But at the end of the day, I think most people would concede it's her choice. If that's what she wants to do to her body, it's up to her. You might try to convince her there's no need to do it, but anyway, it's her choice. Now, what this suggests is that the mere changing or alteration of tissue is not necessarily in itself a bad thing if you want it and you're willing to put up with the risks involved. But if somebody were to perform a labiaplasty on a woman without her consent, as James pointed out, that would just be a severe form of bodily injury and assault. So we need to separate the issue of harm, as in what exactly is the medical complications, from the moral concept of wrong. You wrong a person when you violate their bodily integrity without their consent, even if you don't harm them. So consider the example of a sexual assault or a rape. Let's say that you don't actually cause any tissue damage, so you haven't harmed the person physically. You certainly have wronged them. And that is what is going to be consistent across these cases, is the violation of the person's bodily and sexual integrity. So let's imagine that somebody said, well, but there's all these advantages to doing labiaplasty in infancy, so that's one reason why we should just override this issue of consent. So, she won't remember it. That's an advantage. I hear this about male circumcision frequently in the United States. It'll heal faster. Maybe it's true. It's cheaper and less risky at this age. You don't have to have general anesthesia. The medical risks are lower, so that's a reason to do it earlier. Some people will say her future sexual partners will prefer it. That's a common refrain in the US. Well, some women might not really like it, so we'll just go ahead and do it when he's an infant. It's easier to keep her vulva clean. There's less moist tissue that could trap bacteria. a common refrain in circumcising cultures. Fewer labial injuries during sex, that's probably true. Lower risk of labial cancer, probably true. She won't have to take time off work or school, assuming that this is something that she would later want. Okay, but it's her body, so it's her choice, period. That's the whole ethical argument right there. Even if all these things are true, and there are, as it were, medical advantages to performing the procedure earlier in life, it doesn't matter because she didn't choose it. Here's just a common article about male circumcision, which gives a nice medical gloss to these claims. Infancy is the optimal time for circumcision because an infant's low mobility facilitates the use of local anesthesia. Sutures are not required. Healing is quick. Cosmetic outcome is usually excellent. Cost is minimal. Complications uncommon. Circumcision in adolescence or adulthood might evoke a fear of pain. You'd have to take time off work and school and so forth. So you see the problem I've raised. Now, why does the infant have low mobility? It's not because the infant isn't struggling. It's because the infant has been strapped onto what's called a circumstraint. So this is how, again, we do it in the United States as a routine hospital measure. When boys are brought into the world, they have all four of their limbs strapped to this board, and then they undergo a genital surgery as one of their first experiences of life. Now, the straps here are blue, which I guess is to play on the stereotype color to show you that this is really something that's done for boys. But just imagine that the straps were pink and this was being done to a girl. I think people's moral intuitions would suddenly shift and say, well, clearly something is wrong about this. Now, this sort of medicalized version of circumcision is really a best-case scenario in terms of risks and complications and so forth. This is a traditional Muslim circumcision that's been partially medicalized. So the boy is older here, and you see he's just being held down. I mean, you just have to kind of imagine the experience of that. Somebody you love just literally pinning your arms down while you undergo a genital surgery. Here's a traditional Jewish circumcision. In this case, if it's done traditionally, there won't be any pain control. You may have a drop of wine that's sort of ceremonially placed on the tongue or something like that. Some Jewish circumcisions do involve anesthesia, but if it's done in the traditional way, there won't be any. And because of the great deference that's given to religious practice, you have even more extreme forms of religious genital cutting that are not regulated. And I'll just show you an example of this. This is a procedure called mazitz b'peh, which is an ancient form of circumcision where the moil uses his mouth to supposedly cleanse the wound. Now, thousands of years ago, that may very well have been a hygienic measure, but we have better methods now, and the point is you can transmit the herpes virus this way. And so this is 100% legal in the United States, also in England. Again, you just have to imagine if this were done to a girl, I don't think the laws would be quite so kind. Here we have an attempt to at least regulate this practice in New York City. This was met with great resistance. The thought was that even having the parents sign a consent form saying they acknowledge, they know in advance that there will be oral contact was seen as too much among this very orthodox community. And so Romy Cohen, a representative, said that he'd performed more than 25,000 circumcisions in New York City and elsewhere, almost every time he puts his mouth on the baby's penis. Now, I was going to say when I was preparing this slide that thankfully this is rare. I was going to say, well, this is kind of a rare thing that it's a bit unusual. Most Jews don't know about it, and that's true. But the Orthodox community is very large, and this is not rare. In New York City, it happens 3,600 times every year. Baby boys are born, and there's no regulation. It's not that it's not illegal, it's that it's not even regulated. Between 2000 and 2011, 11 babies contracted herpes and as a result died. Two further had permanent brain damage. Okay, so when people are saying, well, what's the harm of a circumcision? I mean, it's just a bit of skin. Well, I mean, maybe they're thinking, well, there's not that big of a risk of infection if you do it in a hygienic way or something, or maybe they think the risk of surgical complications isn't that high compared to other surgeries. I'm not sure what the claim is exactly. But as we've discussed, there's a difference between harm and wrong. So here you don't have to start to make these gradations about exactly how much tissue is removed. Is it this much or that much? The wrong is done simply in virtue of the non-consensual cutting of an extremely personal part of the body without urgent medical need. That's why it's wrong, regardless of any debate you may have about the degree of physical or other harm. So I'm on to the final bit here. I recognize I'm on a short schedule, so I'll breeze through this part. If you accept that there should be an exception made for religion, this is going to place us into a dilemma with respect to female genital cutting in the following way. If male circumcision should be permitted generally and for any reason, because in some groups it is regarded as an explicitly religious practice, then relatively more minor forms of female genital cutting that are regarded by some groups as explicitly required by their religious understanding, should be given equal consideration and should be permitted for anyone regardless of the reason. Indeed, some prominent defenders of ritual male circumcision who are aware of the existing double standard in the law have recently begun to argue that mild forms of female genital cutting should in fact be tolerated in Western law to detract attention away from the issue of male circumcision. So here's a prominent article in the Journal of Medical Ethics by some leading bioethicists who explicitly argued that because male genital cutting is tolerated in our societies, so too should we tolerate minor forms of female genital cutting. This is the leading medical ethics journal in the world. This is not an obscure publication. But it wasn't just confined to academics. The Economist picked up this argument. And here they say, well, 30 years we've been trying to eradicate a barbaric practice. We haven't made much traction, so it's probably time to try a new approach, by which they mean we should tolerate minor forms of female genital cutting. So this argument is gaining steam. Last bit here. Defenders of female genital cutting are capitalizing on this issue of the double standards that we just accept in our regular discourse. So here's a website that some have launched, very nicely put together, very professional. You go here to the consent and parental rights section, and what kind of arguments do they put here? I'll just walk you through some quotes. Minors, by definition, are incapable of making decisions for themselves. Therefore, consent on behalf of minors is routinely provided to parents, where parents determine what is in the best interest of the child. This right, of course, is not limited by notions of bodily integrity and medical benefit alone. Rather, in securing the best interest of a child, parents rightly consider social, cultural, religious, and familial benefits and harms. Now, you notice there's a hyperlink there. They're actually quoting another source, and I'll just show you what that source is. It's the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force Statement on Male Circumcision. So they take, literally, copying and pasting the text from American Medical Support for male circumcision for cultural, religious, familial, and whatever other benefits, and then they put that on their website and say, well, we get the same consideration. And you know what? They're right. It just is anti-Muslim bigotry to say that, well, in your case, you're not going to get these protections, but we'll let this other religious group have these protections. I mean, that just is a double standard. So the point here is that they're making a good argument, which means that those who want to protect children's rights need to make a better argument. And the argument is that we shouldn't be tolerating one of these practices and allowing the other. So they say, as noted elsewhere on the site, female circumcision is anatomically similar to male circumcision. They're referring to the NIC, the minor form that doesn't remove tissue. So in fact, although it's analogous, it's less invasive than male circumcision. And they say it's our assertion that the female circumcision, if performed correctly under medical supervision, causes no harm. So they now want to medicalize the practice. So they say, well, in the United States, you do circumcision in hospitals. If you're concerned about medical harm, just have doctors do it. We're happy to do the same, just let us keep cutting our girls. Now, what they mean by no harm is there's a relatively low risk of surgical complications as far as we know. I mean, you'd have to conduct some controlled studies to do this, and how long should we be experimenting on the genitals of girls to find out if maybe there are worse complications than they thought? I mean, this is a non-starter. Furthermore, the issue of harm is not just the risk of surgical complications, it's the risk of something times the magnitude of the badness if it happened. If you're cutting a baby's genitals, the risk of something going wrong might be quite small, but if it does go wrong, you've maimed their genitals. And so the magnitude is quite large, and those have to be multiplied together when considering what is really morally at stake. Also, there are many harms besides just medical harms. There's risk of psychological harm when somebody reflects back and is upset about what happened to them. I think I'm on my last two slides here. So Dina Davis says, as long as Western countries continue to countenance male genital cutting, the criminalization of even the ritual nick cannot fail to dilute the persuasiveness of the official stance against FGC while carrying the unmistakable taint of intolerance and double standards. And I argue that to push back against this trend, what's needed is a coherent and conjoined effort on the part of advocates of children's rights to emphasize that it's the lack of consent without medical necessity that's the ethical and moral concern here, not where along a spectrum of sex or gender a person's body happens to fall. The genitals are not like other parts of the body. These points hold regardless of contestable benefit-risk ratios and regardless of the supposed motivation of the parent. As long as you say there's an acceptable motivation for cutting children's genitals, parents simply have to cite that motivation. You can't get inside their head and ask them what's their true motivation. They say, oh, well, we do it for religious reasons, if that's what you need to hear. So this is the strongest argument for protecting children's rights, and I'll just end with a graph. So I'm suggesting that instead of drawing a line here on the x-axis where we say it's permissible to cut genitals to the left of that line, but not genitals to the right of that line, we should turn our attention here to the y-axis, which is about autonomy. And we should say it's not permissible to cut genitals on somebody who can't consent unless there's an urgent medical need and you have to do it to save their life and preserve their future bodily autonomy. But if it's above that line and somebody wants this done to their body, that's fine. It's up to them. It's their body. A quote here to conclude. Feminist organizations are taking up this argument. This is Terre de Femme, a German group, recently celebrated Worldwide Day of Genital Autonomy. And they say, whether it's medical or in a mild way, FGM remains a violation of human rights. So any discussion of whether there could be an acceptable mild form of FGM is rejected by our group. And for that reason, analogously, there's no discussion as to whether it might possibly be acceptable to tolerate a boy's genital injury. Thank you.